I want to begin a bit of a trip looking at, I should say journey because it's got different connotations. A bit of a journey looking at some of the key characters of both the Old and New Testament. Now, this is about as close as I get to preaching from the Old Testament. And I know that some of you are really disappointed about that, and I apologise. We'll do our best. But I want to focus this morning on a person of the Old Testament, the person Joseph. And so I've called this Favoured by God, because that's what he was. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little story. It's a story of my childhood. I actually remember quite a bit of my childhood, which probably tells me it wasn't so bad. You know, some people say they don't remember bits of their childhood and there were traumas and so forth. I actually think probably right through my childhood I was spent in party mode, so I didn't have much of a trauma. But there were certain things in my childhood that I remember vividly. And one of those was the school that I went to. It was Mount Gambier East Primary School. So I'll have a shout out to anyone out there this morning that came from Mount Gambier and were unfortunate enough to be at Mount Gambier East Primary School at the same time that I was. I remember being a rebel, that might really surprise you. But the group of boys I hung out with were a bit like me, unfortunately, and they all came from the dreaded east end of Mount Gambier. And so you had to understand that East Enders were and still are pretty tough people. Our mates were our gang. They were our protection. They were the guys that covered your back. They preemptively took out some of the other kids that had vendettas against you. But East Gambier Primary School was divided from St Mary's Catholic Primary by Dutton Street. Now, anyone that lives in Mount Gambier, and they're probably all online, would be nodding by about now. So I used to walk to school. It was a journey that took me, it was just over 1 kilometre. So as a little guy, I started there when I was in grade 3 and walked every day. I didn't have a bike. I didn't want a bike. I was too tough for bikes. And so I used to go whatever the weather was. My mother worked. She worked in a hotel, cleaning rooms and things like that. So it was a fairly basic income for her. And so I walked 1 kilometre to school, and you've got to understand, guys, this is Mount Gambier. So you walk through rain and hail and snow and gang warfare and stones, and you walk past people's houses and you got abused. And so I'd arrive at school quite dishevelled. My hair would be messed up, and often I'd be covered in mud because, every now and then I'd just dive through a puddle on the way to school. That's actually a true story. And so I arrived at school looking much less good than I do this morning. That's terrible English, and I understand that. And across the road, these Catholic kids, they arrived at school in their parents' SUV, in today's language. It might have been a Mercedes-Benz or something like that. They had the socks up to the knees. Their hair was beautifully combed. They were going to worship Mary before they started school. The whole deal, it was fantastic stuff. And we were the public school gangsters. They were the private school privileged. They were favoured. They were wonderful people. And I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, obviously. I don't know if you understand that North and South Korea is divided by a thing called a DMZ. Has anyone ever heard of that? The DMZ is a demilitarised zone, and it provides a buffer between two nations. It does so to keep them apart, and basically the forces of both those nations are camped around either side of the DMZ. Very occasionally, over the years, the North in particular have waged incursions into the South, and there's been a bit of an upset take place. So the DMZ is often scattered with mines, and there are towers to make sure that nobody's crossing, and if you do, you're probably going to get a bullet in the back on the way through. Although fighting ceased on the 27th of July 1953, the two nations are still very much at war. Well, this was Dutton Street, Mount Gambier. Okay, I just thought I'd paint that picture for you. Dutton Street was a DMZ. And from time to time, the gang from Mount Gambier East Primary School, with myself at the helm, obviously the gift of leadership was always there, would launch an incursion against the Catholic kids. And it was brutal, and it was merciless, and we took no prisoners. We bombed them with water and with ink, and we launched artillery with slingshots over their beautiful white wall. We waged a campaign of propaganda against them and fear. And I was going to tell you what we used to say to them, but it's actually not allowable anymore, so I'm not going to do that. But we used to bombard them with all sorts of propaganda. Anyway, long story short, guys, we won. We won. I looked it up. Actually, the name Robert means winner. So don't ever think about war, guys. Don't ever think about it. We won because East Gambier Primary School is still powering on, and St Mary's Catholic School is now St Mary's Aged Care Facility. And I'm guessing, actually, that some of those kids haven't moved very far. Long story. As kids, we were also merciless to teachers' pets. We didn't like them. Yes, they may have enjoyed the favour of the teacher, but recess time was a different deal. Everybody was a man to himself. And there was all sorts of things happening out in the schoolyard that you wouldn't allow in the schoolyard today. My point this morning, I know it's very long-winded, is that favour can be costly. And our Catholic friends found that out. Now, I love Catholics. I've got no issue with Catholics. It's just unfortunate that that's what they were at that point. Do you know that the followers of Jesus are also favoured by God? We here this morning, we're favoured by God. And the life of Joseph, the son of Jacob, or Israel as he was named, and Rachel is a great example of a favoured person. Joseph was favoured. He learnt that from a very early age. He was like a Catholic kid. I can only hope that one of those Catholic kids turned out to be like Joseph in the end. But I want to pick up the story, or the lead into the story at least, of Jacob in Genesis 37 and from verse 1. If we can just... I got that stirred up with the story and thinking about Gary and Sarah that I've forgotten to plug that in. So favour is costly. Genesis 37 from verse 1. It says, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the son of Bilhah, and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. Verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Can't imagine why they didn't like him. Verse 8, his brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told his brothers, listen, he said, I had another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Verse 10, when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind, as only fathers can. You see, this is the lead-in to a young man who was highly favoured by his father. And unfortunately, his father made it public that he was favoured by giving him the robe. I want us to think about this a little bit this morning, that his life, like ours, we've got to start shaping up to a life of favour, because it won't all be like the graphic that I'm showing you. Joseph's life began with promise. He was a favourite of his father, and he had a very positive outlook and obviously a very healthy self-esteem. Joseph's life looked certain for greatness. When you think about their family, Jacob had 12 sons. He had 6 to Leah, his first wife. He had 2 to Rachel, his favourite wife. He had 2 to Leah's maidservant, Zilpah. And he had 2 to Rachel's maidservant, Bilhah. And so he was obviously a very vigorous kind of a guy, got around a little bit. But Joseph was the firstborn of Jacob's favourite wife, Rachel. Now, for every one of the men in the room here this morning, we're here with our favourite wives, hopefully. My first wife is my favourite wife. We've got to understand, when it comes to favour, guys, that circumstances must not rule. Because Jacob's life took a turn from the moment he was announced as being the favourite son. After Joseph shared his dream with his family, his circumstances began to take on a rapid change for the worse. Now, we shouldn't be surprised when our lives encounter a bit of rough stuff, because we're God's favourites as well, every one of us. You see, God sees you as an individual just like everybody else. You are his favourite. But what took place from there on in is that Joseph was rejected by his own family. In fact, it says in Genesis 37 and verse 4, when his brothers saw that his father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So don't be surprised when the favour of God becomes obvious, as it did with Joseph, that your own family begins to go, yeah, what's going on here? Not so good. Genesis 37 and verse 24, it says, and they took him and threw him into the cistern, and now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Now, a cistern was a well that was generally at least 10 feet deep and probably as much as 30 feet. And so they picked the little boy up and just went, and there was no water in it. So that was his welcome to the family. That was his growing up present. He was rejected by his family. People that are favoured also often have a job done on them. What do I mean by that? Well, Joseph was sold by his brothers. His own brothers sold him to Midianite traders. We mostly know this story. I won't say that we all know it, because some of us won't. In turn, these guys then sold him on to an Egyptian called Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard of the king, of Pharaoh. And so he had a job done on him. He was sold not once, but then twice. And we pick the story up in Genesis 39 and verse 1. It says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, he saw the favour of God, in other words, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did. Joseph found favour in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From time to time, he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned. The Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So the blessing and the favour that was on Joseph was undeniable. Verse 6. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had, with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Nothing's really changed in the 21st century as far as I can see. But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in his house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. This is a trap, isn't it? Verse 12, she caught him by the cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until the master came home. Now this was clearly a set-up job. One little tiny lapse of concentration where Joseph entered the house and there was no one else in the house meant that he had no witnesses, meant that he was left exposed, literally, because he ran out of the house with no clothes, and meant that he was in deep water and unable to really defend himself. So ultimately, Potiphar threw Joseph into prison for a crime that he did not commit. This is a man who was favoured by God. The favour of the Lord was on him. It's obvious. So he was double-crossed. He was also abandoned. While Joseph was in prison, he interpreted a dream for the Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, who was there on Pharaoh's behalf. He was basically the cupbearer. So he was the guy that made sure the king didn't get poisoned. He looked after the cup. The dream was favourable for the cupbearer, and ultimately it meant that Joseph was reinstated to serving Pharaoh. So the favour of God was still on him. But he spent time in jail. Don't forget about that. Verse 40 of Genesis, it says, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of prison." So Joseph was able to interpret the dream and then buy his way out of jail through that interpretation. It then says in verse 23 of Genesis 40, "The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph and forgot him." So this is the kind of abandonment that Joseph experienced, even though he was highly favoured. He was like those Catholic kids. They were subject to the wrath of Gambia East Primary School and everything that came with it. You see, circumstances can be very cruel. And many of us experience this, don't we? The favour of God's on us, and yet through circumstances and through bad fate, through people around us that are jealous of us, that favour can really come under attack. So circumstances can be cruel. The truth is, if circumstances determined the outcome, we would all die frustrated, and some of us will. If, as people favoured by God, you and I will face many circumstances that cause us to question if we're even in the same neighbourhood as God, let alone being favoured by Him. Can anyone identify with that? I've been through that stuff. I know you guys have. And so as God's people, we're going to face those kinds of circumstances. Guys, I want to remind us this morning that we have got to be resilient. We've got to be resilient. We've got to keep our eyes on the prize. We need to constantly remind ourselves that God has favoured us. And often that's why we're in the situation we're in. That's why I said before, when we lay hands on Gary and Sarah, you need to pray for them because they will come under attack more than the rest of us. Christians have got to be resilient, and we've got to be willing to persevere and contend for the things that God promises us. Joseph had a couple of childhood dreams that would later prove true. Like Jacob, sometimes all we do is see God's favour materialise, and yet we find trouble staying the course. Like Joseph, we've got to keep confessing God's goodness. Not as some kind of a chant or rant, but as a reminder to us to remember that God's good. Because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that stands. It's the only thing that doesn't move. And our favour will be obvious. You see, the thing about favour, when it's obvious, it draws fire. People get jealous, people question it, people look at your motives, you'll be under the microscope. There'll be all kinds of attacks that come because of the favour of God. I want to give us this morning 3 keys that I hope will help us stay the course. Because staying the course requires a certain kind of person. We've got to develop resilience. It's actually stubbornness. We've got to be stubborn, even when the benefits are not obvious. I'm not sure that Joseph would have remembered the benefits of God's favour when he was locked up in prison and he was double-crossed by Pharaoh's cupbearer. I'm not sure that he would have understood that God's favour was on him when he was set up by Potiphar's wife. I'm not sure that he would have got any of those things. But ultimately he stayed the course and he was stubborn. He believed the promise. He understood the favour of God. And so the 3 key responses that Joseph can show us as being part of experiencing God's favour and contending with it are quite obvious, actually. Firstly, Joseph was trustworthy. So he remained trustworthy. You see, the thing about people that are favoured is that they remain to the course. They don't deviate from it. And so in his master's household, we see here, it says in Genesis 39 verse 6, so he, that's Potiphar, left in Joseph's care everything he had with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. You see, Joseph had proven himself to be trustworthy consistently over and over again, because you don't leave someone in charge of your house unless that's the case. And so he was faithful in the household with menial tasks. He was also faithful under persecution, in jail. I think I've jumped ahead there a little bit. Genesis 39:6. That was that one. And so in jail, in Genesis 39:22, it says, so the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison. He was made responsible for all that was done there. So even in the midst of persecution, Joseph again proved his worth. He was trustworthy. He was the chief of everyone in jail. He was put in charge. Incredible trust was invested into him because of his trustworthiness. It says the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. You see, when you understand that the favour of God is with you, no matter what the situation you're put in, we can know God's favour. We can see it. We can feel it, and it can be tangible. And it can be obvious to others. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 10, it says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So trustworthiness is a fundamental principle of those of us that are favoured by God, which is everyone in this room if you've confessed Jesus as your Lord. Trustworthy. Secondly, Joseph maintained his integrity. Now, as believers, we're called to be witnesses to the world. And when we do this, integrity is a commodity that's in short supply. When I say integrity, I mean, you know what I mean. What you say is what you do, and what you do is what you say. It's consistent. There's no gap between the two. You see, there are I believe, two common reasons that people don't become Christians. The first reason is that they don't know another Christian. And the second reason is that they do know another Christian. It's very sad that many people that call themselves Christians don't display integrity. And so Joseph maintained his integrity. He was put into situations where it would have been very easy to agree with the mob, to join with the forces in prison and plan their breakout, Freedom Day. All those things he could have gone through. But he didn't do it. He maintained his integrity. He was true to the Lord, and he was true to the Word of God. Genesis 39 and verse 8. But he refused Potiphar's wife's advances. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he's entrusted to my care. That's integrity. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. Now, you don't do that with someone that isn't consistent. So Joseph maintained that. You see, when we hold these things together, no matter what's going on around us, no matter what storms are waged against us, we remain firm. And we may not surface for a little while, and it feels like, to me, that these past 2 years have been a bit like that. Things have been swirling around us. There's been rumours, there's been all sorts of exaggerations on both sides of this big argument that's taking place at the moment. And we as God's people have got to remain firm. You see, there's always middle ground. There's always a place that maintains our integrity. If you don't think stories are being exaggerated on both sides, you should have listened to a news article I heard yesterday on Sky News. See, I'm back on the media. And in the news article, the official from New South Wales made this massive statement and said the Delta virus is 1,000 times worse than the original virus. And then they look at the people on the other side of the equation and say, you guys are just inventing stuff. But we're not. Hello? So there's a whole story going on both sides of the equation right now. And I can't help thinking that we as God's church that are obviously favoured by Him have got to stay the course. We've got to remain in the middle. We've got to be careful not to say things that aren't proven or that aren't truthful. And if we don't know the truth, say nothing. And so Joseph maintained his integrity. I just gave you that for free, by the way. Joseph also entrusted God implicitly. And this is the other thing that we can learn through this past 2 years. Implicit trust doesn't need to be consistently tested. In other words, we don't need to put God in the witness box every time we have a doubt. Implicit trust trusts regardless of what's going on around it. Joseph's dreams ultimately materialized because he trusted God. Firstly, he heard God, and secondly, he stayed the course. Again, Genesis 45 and verse 7. It says, "But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of Egypt." So basically, Joseph stayed the course. The end goal was he got the whole lot. He got the box, the dice, and everything that goes with it. He ended up basically, probably practically, more powerful than Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a figurehead, yes, but Joseph was the guy who basically enacted everything that took place in Egypt. And so implicit trust understands, firstly, that God has a purpose for us. even in the midst of hardship, even in the midst of things that seem endless. Secondly, God often shapes us through disappointment, failure, and shattered dreams. He's doing something in the midst of all that. Now, if Joseph had to pull the plug while he was in jail and gone to the other side, or if he had to pull the plug when his brothers threw him in the well, then the whole of Egypt would have been in jeopardy. They would have perished through famine, and they would have suffered incredibly, and Joseph would have never met the calling of God that was on him. He would have never fulfilled it. Genesis 50 and verse 20, I want to finish off with this one, says this. He says to his brothers and father, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." You see, God has a plan and a purpose for us. We are here, like Joseph, to be catalysts for the saving of many lives. And in the process of doing that, we're going to be tested. Our integrity will be tested. Our trust in God will be tested. The decisions we make will be put under the microscope. The things we say will be tested. And everything we do will feel like we're being watched by everybody. That was Joseph's life. But ultimately, the favour of God was used to save the whole of Egypt. And Israel, by the way, because they were rescued from famine as well. And of course, we know the story. It goes full circle back to right to the point of when his father favoured him and his brothers were jealous. And ultimately they bowed down to him because he rescued them. And even the imagery of the sheaves of wheat were prophetic reminders or prophetic pointers to the mode of rescue. It would come through famine. And so all the promises of God that were given to Joseph came true. And I believe, friends, that all the promises of God that He's given to us will come true if only we stay the course and we understand that this is not going to be a cakewalk. It's not as simple as skipping through life and having that little butterfly land on your finger because God's favour on you and it just sits there forever. It's not going to be like that. We know that, don't we? You are His favourites. We are His favourites. In many respects, we're like Joseph. And we're going to go through all the same kind of testing as he is. And ultimately, God wants us to come out the other end exactly like He has, with the world benefiting from us being